The fan turned slowly in the dark, pushing warm air through a quiet Albuquerque apartment. A birthday balloon drifted near the ceiling, brushing against the light. 10 candles had burned here only hours before. Now the smell of plastic and smoke hangs where laughter once did. When officers entered apartment 808, the air was thick and wrong. They moved toward the faint orange glow coming from behind a closed bathroom door. Each step pressed against carpet damp with something unseen. One officer reached for the handle. The metal was hot. What waited behind that door would mark the limits of language itself. The clock on the stove still blinked 4:31 a.m. Outside, neighbors stood barefoot in the hallway, holding children who didn't understand why the lights had come on so early. Inside, the silence broke open. The body of 10-year-old Victoria Martens lay wrapped in a burning blanket. A birthday had ended with fire. The smoke curled against the tiles. The room had no sound, only the soft crackle of something finishing what had already been done. The building at 9900 Spain Road sat beneath the quiet weight of desert air. Its walls, pale stucco, turned amber by streetlight, framed a dozen lives stacked on one another. Laughter, routine, exhaustion, all held in their own compartments. Apartment 808 was one of them. Ordinary until it wasn't. The door was cracked when officers arrived. The first inside stepped over a pile of laundry and an overturned plastic cup. On the counter, cereal had gone soft in milk. A pink backpack leaned against a chair. The television still glowed blue. They moved slowly, guided by the faint hiss of burning fabric. The smoke wasn't dense enough to choke, only to sting. In the bathroom, where the air shimmered, a blanket was burning against the tiles. When it was pulled back, the fire sighed out, leaving only the smell, sharp, chemical, unforgettable. There, in that strange half-light, the story revealed itself not in words, but in layers of silence. The bathtub, the broken soap dish, the pattern of heat on the walls. This wasn't chaos. It was ritualized disorder, movements performed too quickly, too mechanically, as if to erase what couldn't be erased. The officers said nothing. The ceiling fan still turned. A calendar on the wall read August 2016. The square for the 23rd was circled with a red pen. Victoria's 10th birthday. Hours earlier, she had worn a paper crown and eaten cake from a plastic plate. Her mother, Michelle Martens, had smiled for pictures. A man stood beside her, Fabian Gonzalez, her boyfriend of barely a month. Another figure moved quietly near the kitchen window, Jessica Kelly, recently released from prison, her eyes half-shadowed, her movements unsteady. The night had begun with normalcy. Pizza boxes, candles, a child happy to stay up late. Neighbors heard music. Later, they heard shouting. Around 10, someone saw Kelly carrying the girl toward the apartment, wrapped in a towel, limp. By midnight, the lights dimmed. Then came the screams. The space between sound and silence is where horror hides best. The walls of apartment 808 had heard laughter, television, argument. That night, they absorbed something different, a child's final struggle muffled by distance. At 4:30 a.m., Michelle and Fabian stepped into the hallway. They told neighbors Kelly had attacked them with an iron. Michelle's voice trembled, but her eyes were empty, fixed on nothing. Smoke trailed from the bathroom door. When the police entered, the scene was already quiet. On the living room floor lay remnants of an evening that shouldn't have existed. A melted candle, a deflated balloon, a single pink slipper turned upside down. Everything else was absence, a life reduced to trace evidence. Later, crime scene photos would freeze the apartment as it was found. One shoe, one cup, one burnt edge of a blanket. To the camera, it looked like disorder. To those who stood there, it was an afterimage of control, as if someone had tried to script the destruction. Time moves differently in places like that. Each second stretches until it no longer measures life, only aftermath. When the officers left that morning, the sky was turning pale over the Sandia Mountains. The apartment door closed, and with it the last ordinary day of a city that would remember her name. When morning rose over Albuquerque, the air was already thick with headlines. A young girl found dead in her home. 3 adults taken into custody before sunrise. The kind of story that forces a city to stop pretending it's ordinary. Inside the precinct, the routine began. Interrogation rooms buzzing softly under fluorescent lights. Coffee cooling on metal tables. Recorders clicking into motion. Victoria Martens spoke first. Her voice was soft, flat, almost practiced. She told detectives she'd met Fabian Gonzalez online only weeks earlier. She said she'd wanted companionship, someone to help with the children. What she said next stopped even seasoned officers. A claim that she'd allowed outsiders access to her children for reasons she described as wanting to please them. The statement was documented and later scrutinized, but in that moment it became the spine of a story too unsettling to ignore. In another room, Fabian shifted in his chair, eyes flicking to the mirrored wall. He denied responsibility for the girl's death. He said Jessica Kelly had lost control, that he had tried to intervene. His version twisted into itself, each line contradicting the one before, as if his own account was slipping away from him. Jessica's interview opened differently. She had been out of prison for only 4 days. Her wrists still showed the faint impressions of restraints. She said she remembered confusion, chaos, and little else. Drugs, she told them, had blurred the night. By midday, the evidence team entered apartment 808. They gathered everything: scorched fabric, fingerprints, fibers, a piece of jewelry damaged by heat. The patterns in the room told their own quiet story. No signs of struggle at the entrance, signs of violence concentrated near the bathroom, and efforts to clean afterward. The apartment was so small that every surface had touched another. Nothing could be neatly separated from anything else. The autopsy supported what investigators already suspected. The cause of death involved multiple forms of violence. Further harm had occurred afterward. There were traces of alcohol in her system, but no methamphetamine. That single absence, a drug not present, would later unravel entire narratives that had been hastily constructed. By the afternoon, the police chief called it the most gruesome act of evil he had ever seen. The city wanted justice before understanding. Cameras gathered outside the station. Reporters spoke the name Victoria Martens as if saying it could make sense of it. Court documents were filed quickly. Victoria Martens, Fabian Gonzalez, and Jessica Kelly were charged with first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The words looked procedural on paper. In reality, they described something that still had no language. Each suspect pled not guilty. Their faces appeared on local news, mugshots lined in a row like unfinished sentences. Forensic technicians worked quietly in the background, piecing together fragments, DNA swabs, digital records, text messages between Michelle and Fabian, the timing of calls to 911. Days became weeks. The evidence formed patterns that refused to hold. The story everyone thought they knew began to shift. DNA recovered from the scene belonged to partly someone who wasn't there, an unidentified male, never found. It meant that the central horror might not have unfolded as first believed. By winter, investigators realized that some confessions were false. Michelle's detailed admission that she had watched the assault didn't align with forensic timelines. She had confessed to being present during moments that evidence proved she wasn't. Why she said it, no one could say. Guilt, fear, manipulation, maybe a need to give chaos a shape. District Attorney Raul Torres held a press conference nearly 2 years later. Cameras clicked. He said quietly that most of the details were simply not true. He announced a new direction. Michelle Martens had accepted a plea bargain to 1 count of child abuse resulting in death. The murder and sexual assault charges were dropped. The system corrected itself, but not before the story had already carved itself into public memory. For detectives, the correction felt hollow. They still didn't know who the fourth person was, the one whose DNA lingered on the evidence but never matched any record. The silence around that name became its own weight. Court dates came and went. Gonzalez and Kelly were to be tried separately. Each claimed partial innocence, partial memory. Trials delayed, motions filed, testimony rehearsed. Years passed between the act and accountability. But even as the facts rearranged, the central image never changed. A birthday balloon floating in the corner, the faint burn mark on tile, the way police tape fluttered against an open window. By the time reporters stopped standing outside the courthouse, the case had already turned into something else. Less about guilt, more about how truth dissolves when too many voices try to tell it. The story moved beyond evidence long before anyone realized it. What began as an investigation turned into a slow excavation of minds. 3 people whose lives had intersected for reasons no one could fully map. Michelle Martens had no criminal record, no history of violence, no diagnosis that could explain her indifference. She was a mother who worked long shifts, who once volunteered at her daughter's school, who called child services multiple times to report her own anxiety about men around her children. Every call ended with notes, referrals, nothing more. Somewhere between caution and loneliness, she began inviting danger in. She met Fabian Gonzalez on a dating app. His messages were simple: flattery, empathy, and offer of company. Within weeks, he was living in her apartment. He wasn't a monster in the beginning. He was a man trying to belong somewhere, and belonging can sometimes be more dangerous than hatred. Jessica Kelly entered 4 days before the murder. Released from prison, she arrived with nowhere to go, carrying the raw exhaustion of someone who'd forgotten how to live outside walls. Fabian was her cousin. Michelle let her stay. What followed wasn't planned in the conventional sense. It was a collapse of impulse, drugs, fear, and the strange human instinct to destroy what we can't protect. Michelle's confession later revealed a kind of detachment that frightened even detectives. She spoke of her daughter's death as if narrating someone else's life. Her words were flat, her tone measured, her face almost calm. To some, it sounded like evil. To others, it sounded like someone who had already broken long before that night. The prosecution painted her as complicit. The defense said she was manipulated, isolated by two people who used her trust against her. Somewhere between those theories was the truth. A woman numbed by routine, drifting between guilt and denial, unable to stop what was happening inside her own home. Fabian's psychology was more erratic. He carried a surface charisma that masked volatility. He liked control, but not responsibility. When questioned, he alternated between rage and apathy. He insisted he was innocent, that Jessica acted alone. But his phone records told a quieter truth, a trail of messages arranging, coordinating, deflecting. Jessica herself was the chaos no one could quantify. Her time in prison, her addiction, her sudden release, each piece was a variable in a mind that had never fully stabilized. She later claimed to remember fragments, Victoria's voice, the heat, the smell of bleach. Every detail was incomplete. Trauma has a way of erasing what the law demands to remember. Psychologists later noted the strange symbiosis among the three: Michelle's passivity, Fabian's control, Jessica's instability. Together, they formed a closed system of dysfunction, each feeding the other. In such systems, morality dissolves. What remains is impulse and inertia. There is a moment in every descent when choice disappears. For Michelle, it might have been when she stopped questioning Fabian. For Fabian, when he realized Michelle would never resist. For Jessica, when the line between drug hallucination and violence blurred beyond recovery. The horror wasn't only in the act, but in how normal their hours looked before it. Photos from earlier that day show a mother and daughter at a pool, smiling. The same hands that brushed the child's hair that afternoon would later help destroy what remained of her. Evil, when stripped of myth, is often just vacancy. The slow removal of empathy until nothing interrupts the act. What happened in apartment 808 wasn't sudden. It was built over time, in silence, in small decisions that hollowed out the human core. By the time the night arrived, there was no turning point left. There was only motion, unthinking, unfeeling, irreversible. The city awoke to a story it couldn't process. The apartment complex was cordoned off for days, yellow tape fluttering in dry wind. Reporters stood by the gate, rehearsing lines about tragedy, innocence, and evil. None of those words worked. They sounded too practiced against the raw stillness of what had actually happened. Within 24 hours, 3 arrests had been made. Michelle Martens sat in the back of a patrol car, silent. Fabian Gonzalez tried to shout questions through the glass. Jessica Kelly was trembling, her hands still bearing small burns from the night before. The media published their mugshots side by side. The caption underneath simply read, "Mother, boyfriend, cousin." That order alone shocked people more than any headline. The first hearings were brief. The courtroom smelled faintly of disinfectant and dust, the kind of sterile air that dulls emotion. Reporters scribbled notes. Michelle avoided looking at the gallery, where 2 of Victoria's teachers sat holding each other's hands. The prosecutor's voice echoed through the chamber. First-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The list felt mechanical, like ticking boxes for something that had no precedent. The investigation stretched on, overlapping with the legal process. Each week, new fragments of truth surfaced, some confirmed, others retracted. What emerged wasn't clarity, but erosion. Statements contradicted evidence. Confessions unraveled. The narrative the public had already condemned began to fracture. The police chief's earlier description, "the most gruesome act of evil I've ever seen," remained true, but its meaning grew uncertain. Evil now seemed to shift form with every discovery. By 2018, almost 2 years after the night of the fire, the case had transformed. District Attorney Raul Torres stood before the cameras and said most of what people believed was simply not true. Michelle Martens had accepted a plea bargain, one count of child abuse resulting in death. The other charges, murder, sexual assault, were dropped. It wasn't exoneration, only reduction, but the effect on public perception was seismic. For 2 years she had been the symbol of maternal monstrosity. Now she was something else, either manipulated or broken. No one agreed which. The same announcement revealed something worse. A fourth unidentified male DNA had been found at the scene, a phantom embedded in the evidence. He was never identified, never charged, never found. His existence meant the complete truth had escaped everyone's grasp. Gonzalez faced his own trial years later. His charges, reckless child abuse, tampering with evidence, conspiracy, carried the weight of what could not be proven but could not be denied. The courtroom was quieter by then. The initial frenzy had faded into fatigue. He sat impassive while witnesses described scenes that blurred fact and rumor. In 2022, he was sentenced to 37.5 years, parole eligible after half. The number landed like a measurement of time rather than justice. Jessica Kelly, in her separate plea deal, admitted guilt to reckless child abuse resulting in death. She testified against Gonzalez, describing her own chaos without coherence. In April 2022, she received 44 years. She would serve less than half. The sentences, though heavy on paper, felt weightless in meaning. They accounted for what could be documented, not for what had been lived. Michelle Martens remained a ghost within the system. She served her 12-year term quietly. In prison, she was neither violent nor withdrawn, merely cooperative, a figure hollowed out by routine. When her release date was set for October 2025, the public barely reacted. The outrage had moved on to newer crimes. The city's memory had thinned to a scar. Meanwhile, another investigation unfolded inside the Albuquerque Police Department itself. A civilian oversight inquiry found that officers had ignored earlier referrals from child services about Victoria's safety. One spokesperson had lied to the press about it. Suspensions followed, brief, procedural, almost ceremonial, a single day off duty. No one wanted to reopen what the city was desperate to forget. The family filed a wrongful death suit against the city, alleging negligence, alleging blindness disguised as bureaucracy. They wanted acknowledgement more than compensation. The case was dismissed. Systems rarely convict themselves. In time, the apartment was cleaned, repainted, rented again. The walls that once absorbed screams now reflected silence. New tenants moved in unaware that every nail and tile carried the residue of what happened. Memory lingers in material things, it just loses witnesses. For Albuquerque, the case became less a headline than a parable whispered in schools, shelters, and social service offices, a warning about the cracks no one sees until a life slips through them. Child Services reviewed policies. Police training manuals added a paragraph about interagency referrals. On paper, reform. In reality, repetition waiting to happen again. Each anniversary brought brief returns of attention. Balloons left near a playground, candlelight vigils attended by a few neighbors who couldn't forget the smell of that night. Reporters filmed the same corner of the building, the same parking lot, the same silence. The footage looked identical each year, as if time itself refused to move forward. The name Victoria Martens endured, but in fragments. To some, she became an emblem of systemic failure, to others a story too unbearable to repeat. Her photograph, a smiling child with missing front teeth, circulated online each August before vanishing again beneath newer tragedies. In the courthouse records, her case closed with numbers and signatures. The documents noted convictions, plea deals, and dates. None of them mentioned balloons, laughter, or the sound of a ceiling fan turning in the dark. The machinery of justice had done its part. What remained unsaid was the question it couldn't answer: how a world so saturated with warnings still failed to see a child in danger standing in plain sight. In the years since, the city of Albuquerque has continued to hum as cities do, lights flickering in apartment windows, cars whispering down Central Avenue, sirens rising and fading like a recurring dream. Time didn't erase what happened inside apartment 808. It only rearranged it into something people could look at without falling apart. There's always a point when tragedy becomes history, and history becomes someone else's story to tell. But some stories resist translation. They linger not because of gore or spectacle, but because of what they reveal: that the ordinary can be the most dangerous disguise of all. The case of Victoria Martens sits there, unresolved, not in law, but in meaning. It asks questions that systems can't answer: how evil incubates quietly inside routine, how loneliness becomes permission, and how every unchecked warning grows into catastrophe. If you stand outside that building now, the wind carries no trace of what was done. The stucco has been repainted, the number on the door replaced. Someone else's laughter filters through the walls, yet the air, for those who remember, still feels heavier than it should. Memory has no physical form, but it clings to certain coordinates like dust that can't be cleaned away. Detectives who worked the case have since retired. They rarely speak of it, but when they do, their tone changes, slower, softer, not out of reverence, but fatigue. They all describe the same moment: the bathroom door opening, the quiet that followed, the collective realization that something sacred had been violated beyond repair. Not just a life taken, but the idea that childhood is safe by default. Forensic photos sit in storage now, sealed under case numbers and confidentiality laws. To most, they are evidence, but to those who've seen them, they are something else. Proof that human cruelty doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it's methodical, deliberate, quiet enough to coexist with dinner plates, with laughter, with the hum of a refrigerator. Michelle Martin's release date, October 14, 2025, hovers on a calendar that most people will never see. She will walk out into sunlight again. There will be no cameras waiting, no crowds. She will disappear into the vast anonymity of the American landscape. A woman whose name once filled headlines, now blending into background static. The law has no category for what she carries inside her. Guilt, grief, confusion, it calls none of them crimes. Fabian Gonzalez sits behind concrete and wire, marking years in a place where time loops endlessly. He maintains fragments of his innocence. He blames drugs, fear, other people. Each letter he writes to lawyers or relatives repeats the same phrase: "I didn't kill her." The system hears him, but doesn't believe. The paradox of guilt is that even the innocent are contaminated by proximity. Jessica Kelly wakes each morning under the same fluorescent light, halfway through a sentence that was never meant to rehabilitate, only to contain. She cooperates in programs, attends therapy, participates in chapel sessions, but people who visit her say she seems suspended, unfinished, as if she's waiting for something to start again that never will. In her statements, there's no narrative, only fragments, images without order, the sound of running water, a spark, a scream, the memory of fire. The unidentified man, whose DNA still floats like static in the case files, remains theory. He exists as a forensic ghost, no match in any national database, no face, no name. That mystery has become the dark center of the story, the void around which everything else orbits. Police still describe it as an open lead, though years have already hardened it into myth. Maybe he was real. Maybe contamination. Maybe the system itself leaving its trace where it shouldn't have. Every possibility is equally unsatisfying. For those who study crime, the Martens case is a lesson in complexity. It exposes the fragility of narrative, how every version of the truth depends on who's speaking and what they need to believe. The mother who says she confessed to crimes she didn't commit. The prosecutor who says the facts never aligned. The media who framed it as the most evil story in New Mexico's history. Each was right in fragments and wrong in others. Together they form the incomplete mosaic of what humans do when faced with the unthinkable. We explain it until it stops feeling real. Psychologists who later reviewed the transcripts pointed to a deeper phenomenon, something beyond individual pathology. They called it shared dissociation, a group dynamic where denial becomes survival. Michelle, Fabian, Jessica, none of them operated in isolation. Each depended on the other's silence to remain intact. The result wasn't conspiracy, but entropy. A slow degradation of reason until destruction felt like inevitability. The case also reshaped how institutions define accountability. The Children, Youth, and Families Department had received 5 calls about the Martens household. Each was logged, assessed, and filed away. In bureaucratic language, the system had functioned as designed. But function in this case meant permission. Permission for negligence, for fragmentation, for tragedy to slip between departments like sand between fingers. Policies were rewritten afterward, meetings held, procedures tightened. Yet policy cannot produce instinct. You can teach oversight, not awareness. When people speak of Victoria now, they avoid the details. They mention her smile, her drawings, her love for swimming. They speak softly, as if loudness might disturb the fragile peace she's owed. In classrooms across Albuquerque, teachers still bring her name up in safety seminars, not as a horror story, but as a reminder of vigilance. The irony is that vigilance only matters after loss. Her funeral took place 2 months after her death. Hundreds attended, though most had never met her. The service was quiet, filled with pastel flowers and the dull murmur of disbelief. The priest's words were brief. We ask not why she was taken, but how we will now live in a world that allowed it. No one clapped, no one cried loudly. Grief had flattened into exhaustion. Years later, on the anniversary, neighbors leave candles near the old complex. Some still live in the building, unable or unwilling to move. They describe odd sensations, the feeling of warmth near the bathroom window when the nights turn cold, the faint smell of smoke that sometimes appears without cause. Rational or not, the human mind makes patterns to survive what it cannot process. In the end, what remains of the case is not justice, but residue.
the kind that settles invisibly into the city's consciousness. Parents who check locks twice before bed. Teachers who hesitate before dismissing a child's sudden quietness. Police officers who move slower at domestic calls because sometimes silence hides the loudest crimes. The story doesn't end with the verdict or the release date. It ends, if at all, in the small human recalibrations that follow. The understanding that evil, stripped of mystique, is often procedural, a sequence of ordinary failures accumulating until catastrophe becomes inevitable. The cruelty lies not only in the act, but in the waiting. Every moment someone noticed something and chose not to act. If you trace the timeline backward, you don't find one explosion of horror, but a long, invisible collapse. Phone calls unreturned, welfare checks skipped, a system designed to distribute responsibility so evenly that no one feels it entirely. And in that vacuum, a child lived and died, surrounded by adults who mistook passivity for care. Time, indifferent as ever, continues. The file labeled Victoria Martens now sits in an archive box among thousands of others. Dust gathers. The paper will eventually yellow, the ink will fade, but somewhere in the quiet rooms of memory, the story will keep whispering the same unfinished question: who was supposed to protect her? Outside, life moves with its usual rhythm. Children laugh at playgrounds. Balloons rise and burst in the afternoon sun. Somewhere, a mother sings absent-mindedly while folding clothes. None of them know they are the ending to her story, proof that despite everything, innocence tries again every morning. And yet, beneath that renewal, a shadow remains, thin, persistent, invisible. It is the reminder that horror rarely arrives as a stranger. It grows within the walls we call home, unnoticed, until one night someone smells smoke and everything ordinary becomes evidence.